We're back with another episode of App Stories. Today's episode is brought to you by SetApp. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is a returning Federico Viticci. Hey, Federico.
Hello again. It's good to be back.
It is very good to have you. Jonathan did a great job last week talking to us about watchOS 11, which of all the OSs, Federico, I'm most excited about it because I've been using it all summer. I think that the live activities in the Smart Stack are a really great addition to the OS, and I've enjoyed some of the fitness things that have been added as well. So we went through all those details last week, and it's a great preview for that kind of stuff. But today, you and I are going to talk all about podcast apps, because I know that we've been flipping between a bunch of different well-known podcast apps looking for an ideal. And I think, in a way, you talked about this a little bit, I think, on Connected this past week, where, it's a little bit like email apps. Not to say that there are no good podcast apps. I actually think there are lots of good podcast apps, but I also feel like there's not necessarily the one podcast app that fits me personally and the way that I listen to podcasts. And I think that that's true for you as well as a bunch of other people. So we thought we would explore that a little bit more today.
And I think it's great, right, that there are so many valid and full-featured podcast clients.
Great.
I think it's one of the beautiful things of the podcasting space is that as long as you just take your subscriptions with you, you can keep listening. And obviously, you're gonna lose data if you switch between clients. Like, you're gonna lose like the played status for an episode of a particular show, for example. But by and large, podcasting, the way we think of podcasting is all about data portability and being able to enjoy your favorite show in whatever podcast app you want. So I do think it's great that there's so much choice these days, especially on the iPhone. There are also some really valid options on Android, but obviously we're gonna focus on iOS here, because right. I think, by and large, we listen to our shows on the iPhone and maybe on the Apple Watch. I know that I occasionally do on the Apple Watch, but I mostly do on the iPhone personally.
Yeah, no, I'm the same way. Although I do appreciate, an Apple Watch has become a must for me, because that's one of the things I do when I go out and exercise. I often listen to podcasts, and having the ability to have those stream or download from a cellular network onto my watch while I'm away from home and away from my iPhone is really nice. And that's one thing that Apple Podcasts does really well. But we will get into those particular apps in a minute. I think we should talk a little bit about maybe what the basics are and really what every podcast player needs to have. So let's run through some of these core features really quickly, Federico, because I think people are familiar with them, but it makes sense to kind of mention them because we're going to be touching on a bunch of these. And to me, one of the first things is discovery. Discovery is not a thing that I use a lot in my podcast apps, but you obviously have to have some sort of directory, a way to find the shows that you enjoy, discover new ones if you're looking for something new. And also just adding ones other ways, whether it's by an actual adding a URL. Then, of course, you need to have some sort of playback controls. Obviously, play, pause, and skipping forward and back. Personally, I really appreciate when I can vary those skip forward and skip back things. Obviously, I like to be able to skip between chapters, but also skip forward and back in time in different chunks, depending on whether I'm going forward and back. I'm a little particular about that myself. And then it really helps too if there's some sort of thing that's similar to Smart Speed and Voice Boost, which are the terms that Marco Arment uses in Overcast, but similar features are found in other podcast apps as well that basically reduce the silences in pauses in speech, as well as enhancing the vocal ranges in the waveform of the audio itself.
Yeah, and there's a long list of other like playback options that maybe are not like essentials, but they are for me. But maybe they're not for other people. But I can mention something like a sleep timer, for example, which is another feature.
Do you use that? You use that much?
Sometimes.
Okay.
Not really much, but I've used it on a couple of occasions. Something that I always use is the variable speed control. So I listen to all my podcasts at 1.2 or 1.3x in addition to Smart Speed and Voice Boost. So yeah, that for me is essential to be able to adjust the default playback speed when I'm listening to something, because
Okay.
1x is just too slow. And I need to. I have more things that I want to listen to than I have time in the day for them. So that's why variable speed.
Yeah, I do less of that than I used to. I actually listen to a smaller subset of shows than I used to, mainly because I don't commute anymore. And so most of my podcast listening happens on walks or jogs or maybe in the car. But since I live in a very walkable place, I'm not in the car a lot these days either. So it all has kind of reduced my podcast listening overall as a result. But finally, I do want to mention management and organization. And this is probably one of the areas we're going to talk about the most, because podcast players tend to take quite different approaches to things like creating user-created playlists and queues, and whether they're automated ones that are there just part of the built into the app itself, or user-created ones, and how you manage, especially if you're a person who listens to a lot of shows, which ones are available and in what order. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by SetApp, an app subscription service that offers dozens, in fact, over 250 apps for Mac and iOS. On SetApp, users can get a plan that covers just the Mac, apps for iOS, or both. With SetApp, you can install and use apps as needed to do things like file conversion, coding, writing, emailing, editing, working with AI, or working with images, videos, PDFs, and a ton of other things, including Mac maintenance and customization tools. Some of the most used apps on SetApp include the massively popular cleaner called Clean My Mac X, plus Bartender, and of course, Permute for converting video, and CleanShot X for taking screenshots. You can also get a VPN, a battery manager, manage your clipboard, and find tools for file management, password management, and a bunch more. What SetApp does is it saves you the time of doing all the research and setting up app subscriptions, because they've done that work for you. It makes finding and trying new tools for your Mac and iPhone stress-free, so you can get your work done faster and get away from that screen. Users in the EU might appreciate that SetApp also recently launched a beta of its very own alternative app marketplace called SetApp Mobile. In the EU, iPhone users can subscribe to SetApp Mobile, install it on their iPhone, and browse iOS apps available in it directly from the SetApp Mobile app. It's a collection that's different than you'll find in SetApp worldwide. Getting back to that worldwide desktop version, SetApp also offers amazing AI-powered apps that support the latest models like GPT-4o and DALL-E 3. You can access AI models in the app, use your own API key, or subscribe to a SetApp AI Plus plan. One of the interesting apps that SetApp has for AI users is PDF Pals that actually lets you chat with your PDFs. But you can also find apps that generate text, help you get real-time assistance in meetings, generate meaningful file names and screenshots, and more. And if you haven't tried SetApp yet, you can do it for free with a 7-day free trial. And with a special link that's in our show notes, App Stories listeners can get 20% off on SetApp's most versatile Mac plus iOS annual plan. So head on over to setapp.com to learn more about this fantastic service, and use that link in the show notes to get a special deal just for App Stories listeners. Our thanks to SetApp for their support of the show. So where should we go from there, Federico? We should maybe talk about, I want to get to what we want, but I also think like there's I think that there's a root problem here that we ought to acknowledge up front, which is I hear a lot from people, and we've had a lot of discussions about this in our Club Mac Stories Discord in particular, that everybody just wants a simple podcast player. And the problem is that very much like email, what simple is means something different to every single person, because everybody has 2 or 3 features that are the core features. And, most of the time with a podcast player, you're starting playback and then you're putting your iPhone back in your pocket. You're not staring at the app the entire time that you're listening, but it is important to be able to kind of get in there, find what you want, start things up the way you want to start them up. And so it seems like a thing that should have a simple solution. But the reality is that I think there are so many different ways that people approach their collection and catalog of podcasts that it's very difficult to land on one particular player that everybody can agree is that simple podcast that solves the solution for everybody equally well.
I think if everybody is looking for a simple podcast app and they're saying, well, I just need 2 or 3 features. But if those 2 or 3 features are different for everyone, then suddenly a developer finds themselves having to build an app with 25 features to accommodate for all the possible combinations of those. Like, I just need 2 or 3 features, but like all of our needs are different. And so you run into the problem where you think you're asking for a simple podcast app, just like you think you're asking for a simple email client or for a simple RSS app. But because these systems are so modular and so complex, and because our needs are so different as people, it's more aspirational to say, I'm building a simple podcast app than it is practical, in my opinion.
I think that that's right. And I think to me that the solution to the simple podcast player is customization and putting the power in the hands of the user to make the app what they want, whether that's hiding features that they don't use or tweaking features to their own liking. When I'm thinking about things like playlists. And to me, that's where customization comes in, which I think, various podcast players do it to varying degrees of success. But that's where I kind of look for. I look for ways I can hide the things I don't need and emphasize the things that I want the most.
Yeah. That being said, I think we have, we have done these episodes before. We talked about our ideal read later app, ideal email client.
Mm-hmm.
We should get to what we actually want. So why don't you tell me, John, what is it that you want in a podcast app? And do you think you have found a solution to what you want?
Well, the big spoiler is that I have not found the solution to what I want. I'm not at a place.
Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing this episode, I guess.
Exactly. I will say, and this is not maybe a popular take, but I actually like a lot of what Apple Podcasts does, because Apple Podcasts, there are aspects of it that I don't like. There's this whole tab bar thing going on in Apple Podcasts, and I don't use most of these tabs. But I have, most of the last 12 months, I have used Apple Podcasts. I'm currently using Overcast, though. And what I do like about Apple Podcasts is the customization of the library tab. Because the library tab has one tab called Latest, which is just a chronological list of the most recent episodes that have come in from my podcasts that I listen to. And it has a saved list. And so what I have done, I don't use... I agree with the criticisms of Apple Podcasts that the queuing system is a little confusing, that Up Next is also confusing because it puts things in there that are just things that it'll think you like and not in a particular order. So what I do is when I'm using Apple Podcasts is I go into the latest episodes, I scroll through, find the ones that I think I will want to listen to, and I save them. It's really just a long press and a tap for each one of those. And that's a very quick way to create a saved list, which you can then go through and start playback from. So that, to me, the essence of what a good podcast player is for my personal use case is to have playback controls that are always easy to get to, make it easy to reveal both the chapters and the show notes, but also then switch back to a very simple queuing system, which is what Apple Podcasts kind of does, because it has this floating player element at the bottom of the view that allows me to quickly get back into the full screen view, nearly full screen view of what I'm listening to, and then get into the details, whether it's the chapter markers or whether it's the information about that show and all the links that it's got. But then I can swipe down and very quickly get back to those saved and latest episodes and start playback. So that's kind of what I'm looking for in this. And what Apple Podcasts allows me to do with that library view is hide all of the pieces that I don't use, because there are also things like lists of shows, which I actually do leave showing most of the time, but not because of the way I listen to podcasts, but because I manage our Mac Stories podcasts, channels and downloads. And I don't look at channels and downloads really. I just deal with my latest and my saved. I don't even need this recently updated piece that they have in the library with the grid of shows. That's kind of interesting to me, but that takes me to the show. I want to go to the most recent episodes, not the shows.
Yeah, so my main problem with Apple Podcasts, I mean, besides the lack of audio effects,
right,
is how the queue works. And even like disregard how Up Next puts in episodes like that are recommended to you, as opposed to episodes that you actually queued. My problem is that when you open that queue, that playing next queue in the now playing screen, if you tap on something else, which is something that I do, I have my podcast queue and maybe I'm listening to an episode, but then I realize, oh, there's this other one that I want to start. And so I start that. If you do that in podcasts, the episode you're listening to goes away. Instead of being put back into the queue, it goes away. And that's a behavior that I don't like.
Yeah, it's maddening. And that's why I don't use that at all. I use the saved, which is a trick I think I learned from you. I save them. And if you save something, it stays in the save list.
It stays there.
Until you remove it. And so for me, it's a very manual process, but at the same time, it's relatively few taps and presses in order to kind of move things around and remove and get them going again. So, it's a compromise, but that is one aspect of this that I do kind of like. That said, I've been using Overcast for the past month or so because I think that, Marco has rewritten this app from the ground up. As it stands today, it's not a lot different other than some UI tweaks than the app that we had before. However, I know that he's working on a lot of new features, and I kind of wanted to refamiliarize myself with what was going on with Overcast so I can try out these new features and maybe it will get me closer to my ideal. But there are things about Overcast that bother me too, just as there are with Apple Podcasts. And so lately I've been thinking, well, maybe I need to try Castro again because, Castro I used for quite a while and I abandoned because it was neglected and it started getting buggier and buggier and the updates started getting fewer and far between, which led me to believe that it was a dying app. But it was not that long ago. I guess, I don't know, maybe it's been 3 or 4 months now, or maybe even longer. It was sold to a developer who makes a very popular Android podcast player. And they've been working very, very hard on fixing all those bugs. And I think most of that stuff now has been corrected. Yep. And now they're looking at modernizing the feature set and bringing it into, 2024, which is great because I do like the way the queuing system works in that app.
Yeah, that's one of the things I love about Castro. So I've also been in between podcast apps and in trying to come up with ideas for this episode, like what's my ideal podcast app? And there's two things that absolutely need to exist in my ideal podcast app. The first one is audio effects and variable speed. Like the audio experience needs to make me save time when I'm listening to a podcast. I need to be able to trim silence, to boost the voices, which is especially important when I'm listening via my Meta Ray-Ban glasses when I'm walking outside. I need to have voice boost, and I need to be able to tweak playback from 1x to 1.2 or 1.3x. That's my sort of my threshold for comfortable listening, 1.2 or 1.3. The second thing is I like to listen to podcasts by seeing what's coming out in terms of like the latest episodes of all the shows that I'm listening to, that I'm subscribed to. And then I want to be able to pick and choose episodes, put them in a queue, and rearrange that queue in the order that I want to.
Same here.
This is why I cannot use Apple Podcasts, because the queue is not reliable. Like if I tap on something else, the previous episode goes away. That is not a solid structure for the sort of queue-based experience that I like. So I've mostly been in between Overcast, Castro, and Pocket Casts. I used Pocket Casts for the past year, and I left it behind because the refresh times for monitoring new episodes had gotten so slow to the point where I knew that an episode of one of my shows was out, but I couldn't see it for several minutes in Pocket Casts. And so I left behind a couple of months ago and I started moving in between Castro and Overcast because I knew that there was a new version of Overcast coming out. However, just yesterday, the combination of our friends Mike and Steven changed my perspective once again.
Yes.
Mike did because Mike informed me of a setting that makes the Overcast queue behave more like I want to. And Steven, because Steven alerted us of the fact that Pocket Casts is now much faster at pulling in new episodes.
Federico, if it makes you feel any better,
Okay.
I had completely missed that tip that Mike gave you as well. And it's a great tip because one of the things that one of the friction points for me with Overcast was if I have a latest playlist and a queue playlist, is that the number of taps to get things from one list to the other.
Yeah. So the aforementioned tip is the fact that Overcast by default works by adding an episode from your latest episode's view to your queue. And my complaint about that was that there was no way for me to quickly know from the all episodes view whether a specific episode had already been queued or not.
Right.
Mike told me that you can replace the add to queue functionality with move to queue. And if you move an episode to the queue, well, it's gone from the all episodes view because it's been moved to the queue. Now, the thing about Overcast is that the audio quality is the best one in the business, in my opinion. Like,
I agree.
Marco is the creator of these effects by and large. He came up with these ideas and it shows. Like, the way Overcast sounds, I think it's still the best one. However, there are some elements of the redesign of Overcast that I'm struggling a little bit to they're not quite gelling with me still right now. And the thing is, Castro has been built around the concept of triaging your podcast queue. Like, the entire app is predicated upon that interaction. You have an inbox of your shows and you move them to your queue and you manage your queue with drag and drop. It's very intuitive on the iPhone. The entire app has been built around that experience. However, the audio effects are not as good as Overcast, and it's just a fact. Overcast sounds better. Pocket Casts used to be slow to update. It seems to be much faster now. I'm trying it again, and this morning it pulled in a new episode for Triple Click, which is a video game podcast that I recommend, just as quickly as Castro did. Pocket Cast has, in my opinion, a great now playing screen design with tabs to move between the playback controls, the show notes, chapters, and your bookmarks, which is a feature that Pocket Cast has. The audio effects, in my opinion, are second to Overcast. They're better than Castro and not as good as Overcast, but they're a close second, in my opinion. I love the fact that Pocket Cast is cross-platform, so you can use it on iOS or Android. And I love that it's got a stats screen. You can go into settings and there's a statistics page that shows you how many hours of content you've listened to, how much time you've saved thanks to trim silence, and I like that. I like that idea. So here's the thing. Right now, I guess my ideal app would be, think about it this way. It could be a Castro that sounds as good as Overcast, or it could be an Overcast that is less reliant on playlists and more optimized for people who like to put episodes in a queue. Or it could be a Pocket Casts that feels more native to iOS in places like Overcast does.
Yeah.
None of this exists. And I think if you came to me now and said, Ticci, you gotta pick one. On balance, I think the reasonable option for me would be Pocket Casts because it's like a regular podcast experience, but it works really well with the queue. I love the fact that the queue is integrated with the now playing screen, and I love the custom icons, I love the settings, and I love the stats. but it's very much all up in the air. And I think, the way I described my relationship with these three apps is how I think about my ideal client. But I also think right now, this is something that I believe, I feel like Overcast has the most momentum, maybe.
I think it has the most momentum and the most potential, really, when it comes right
and it
down
feels
to
like
it.
Marco is really having fun with it again.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it feels like Overcast got the juice right now. You know,
Yeah.
I think it feels like that.
I have the same sense, and that's why I'm on it right now. And it's funny. I think we're coming at this from a very similar place. Although for me, for whatever reason, I don't know why, Pocket Casts has never really clicked with me. Maybe I should give it another try, but it's just never, I've always just bounced off of it, and I can't really put my finger on exactly why that is. I think in fairness to Overcast, it was developed a long time ago in a time when I think that maybe people were, and there's still a lot of people like this, but I think almost everybody who started using Overcast in the early days was a podcast completionist. And
Yes.
And it works very, very well for somebody who wants to have all their podcasts in one place and save them. I mean, you can save them in perpetuity if you want to. I don't do that personally. I've become more of a queue person just because out of sheer busyness, I don't listen to every single episode of most of the shows that I listen to. There are a few that I listen to everything, but really not that many. I just have to pick and choose, and I like picking and choosing. But Overcast is perfect, I think, if you are a completionist and really have a large number of podcasts that you're managing, because my number of shows it probably pales in comparison to some of the people who I've heard from, both in our club Discord and elsewhere, and what they're listening to.
Yeah, and I feel like Overcast was built like that, and maybe it still is built like that. With the podcast completionist in mind, which I absolutely am not. Like, I don't care. I don't want to listen to every single episode of every single one of the shows that I'm subscribed to. Like, it's just what it is. And I need to be able to flip around back and forth between episodes. Like, maybe I start with 20 minutes of Upgrade, and then I want to make sure that I listen to the entirety of Into the Aether, and then I'm moving back to Upgrade again. It's very fluid. And I think Castro, for that reason, lends itself well to that sort of interaction. At the same time, I understand why the Pocket Casts UI maybe doesn't go well with a lot of people. It is kind of Androidy in places. What I do like about it, it's like a collection of small things. Like, for example, how the now playing screen, when you swipe down on it and it sort of collapses into this floating playback bar, it gives you a bunch of information at a glance, even when it's collapsed. For example, it shows you a progress bar. So in the floating playback control, you can see your progress in the episode, and you can also see the number of episodes that are queued, because there's a little badge indicator on the right side of the floating bar. So that tells you have, for example, right now I have 6 episodes in my queue, and the queue is also accessible. It's called Up Next, and it's accessible from the now playing screen by tapping on a button in the upper right corner. I also like that you can now create these bookmarks in Pocket Casts. So if you want to bookmark a specific point of an episode, because maybe they're saying something useful or a joke or whatever, you can create a bookmark, and those bookmarks get synced across platforms. So you can find them on the web, find them on Android, and so forth. I also like how when you're going to an episodes page, for example, you can see which episodes you have already queued, because they get a little indicator that says, well, this episode is already in your queue. And that's a little touch that I like, which Overcast doesn't have, for example. Overcast doesn't have an indicator for episodes that you have already queued.
Right.
On the other hand, there's Castro, and Castro has something that I absolutely love, which is when you go to your queue in Castro, you can choose different visualizations for your queue. So you can view your queue by episodes. So that's a vertical list of episodes, one after the other. Or you can say, well, I want to see my queue, but group the episodes by show. So I can see, for example, right now that I have one queued episode from App Stories, 3 from Into the Ether, and 1 from the Besties. So being able to see your queue in different ways, because maybe you want to, I don't know, binge a specific show from your queue and then move on to something else, but those episodes are otherwise not right next to each other in the episode view, you can just switch to the show view, and that allows you to see all those episodes together. I think that's a really clever touch. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I think having those kind of options is fantastic. And I do think that part of what you're describing is that some shows and the way you move around from show to show and maybe within an episode is that some things are more timely, they get more news oriented and you want to listen to them first, but there may be another one that is more evergreen. And so maybe when you're done with your newsy shows, you go back to the evergreen one and you listen to that for a half an hour. And then, another new newsy one just came out. I'm going to listen to that and then flip back to the evergreen one. I do that kind of thing all the time.
Yeah, so I don't know where that leaves us in terms of what's our ideal podcast app. For me, it comes down to choosing between these 3. And each of them have, I think I maybe see Overcast and Castro as the 2 ends of the spectrum, and Pocket Casts sort of as the balanced option in the middle. At least that's how I'm looking at it right now. And maybe I will go with the balanced option. But I think ultimately, all 3 of them are excellent podcast client.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I think that they're all heading, I think, in a good place in a sense, because I think what from this conversation, one of the things I take away is that customization is important, because that is how you're going to allow 2 different people with 2 different simple podcast apps they want to get what they want. And I also think, though, that I really like the idea of the floating playback bar. I really think that works super well, because it makes it very easy to switch back and forth between the 2 most important things, at least in my mind, for a podcast player, which are obviously playback, but also get back to the details, whether it's the show notes or the chapters or whatever it happens to be. All right, Federico. Well, I don't think we've solved any problems today, but we have hopefully given some podcast developers things to think about, and maybe some listeners some things to think about too, because I think this is a category, like a lot of ones we've discussed in these overview type of episodes, where it does pay to kind of move around and try different things just to get a feel for whether there's something out there that fits better with your personal preferences and that sort of thing. But until next week, Federico, I want to say thank you again to our sponsor, that was SetApp. You can find the 2 of us over at macstories.net. We are also on Mastodon. Just go to vitici.macstories.net and johnvorhees.macstories.net to follow us there. And we're on Threads and Instagram. Federico is at Vitici. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHNVOORHWES. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.